Happy New Year. Our text today is John chapter 6, from 16 to 21. And our title is The Underrated Rescue. There are two back-to-back miraculous events in the text. Firstly, Jesus walking calmly on the tumultuously stirred up sea. That's verse 19. And the immediate, instantaneous blink of an eye zip through 3 or 4 miles of open water. That's verse 21. Very clearly, these two miraculous signs, they figured prominently among Jesus' 300 plus recorded signs and miracles in the New Testament. Remember a few weeks ago how Jesus himself highlighted those signs and miracles? Those signs and miracles were the second, if you remember, of the Father's 3 witnesses in that 5th chapter discourse that we looked at. But here we are. Very little is made of these miracles by the Apostle John. Why is that? Why is John's account of these miracles so terse? Why does he present them almost skeletally? Why does John present this passage so thinly? Why does his account read almost as though these were all just barely an aside, a footnote? Why does he not make more of these 2 miracles? And if he doesn't make much of these, why even mention them at all? They're logical, natural, authorial intent questions to ask of our text, I thought. So that's where we'll start this morning. We'll try and chase those questions down. Let's stand and honor the Word of God as we read from our text. Read it together, John 6. We'll start from verses 14 to 15 so we catch the context. John chapter 6, 14 to 15. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. Now today's passage, verses 16 to 18. First, now, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea began to be stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. Then, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." So they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Please be seated. Now, do you see why I asked those questions? 4 verses. Barely 120 words in the New American Standard. They sound almost like an afterthought, coming after John's exhaustive narration of the feeding of thousands in verses 5 through 15. Interestingly, bits and pieces of these very same events are reported in the synoptics in Matthew chapter 14 and in Mark chapter 6. And by putting those different narrations together, one can get a clearer picture of the events that are reported so meagerly in John. Here's what we'll see as we do that. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 48. This is immediately after the feeding of the thousands. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land, seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. I want you to take note. Mark says Jesus himself sent his disciples away on that boat. Very clearly, he sent them away knowing fully well that they would get caught up in that storm. That's verse 45. And that later, from where he was, alone on the land. It says in verse 46, he closely watches them straining at the oars in the thick of that storm. Note that those details are not reported by John. But it's really quite typical of eyewitness accounts by three different people. You'd expect there to be some differences. You'd naturally expect some details reported by some that are not observed by the others. But of course, skeptics, naysayers will jump at these differences to argue a case against the reliability of the Scriptures. But they're easily enough explained. After all, each eyewitness is simply reporting from his own vantage point and his own appreciation of events. And that's exactly what we see here in the differences between John and Mark. Matthew, in chapter 14, adds the following in verses 23 to 25. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on that mountain to pray by himself. And it was evening. He was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You certainly are God's Son." Now that says a whole lot more, doesn't it? John told us in John 6, verse 16, that it was evening when the disciples started to cross the Sea of Galilee to Capernaum. And in verse 17, that it was already dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. But Matthew, he explicitly tells us it was almost daybreak. The fourth watch of the night, it says, when Jesus came, walking on the sea. That's in verse 25 of Matthew 14. Well, what does that mean? That means that they had been rowing against the wind for hours. They were way out on the sea, and they had not made much headway in all of those hours. Really quite remarkable that John would omit all of that, don't you think? 2, John omits that part about Peter going out to walk on the water, and Jesus' resulting rebuke. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Verse 31. Notice that John also omits that part about the wind strongly blowing, coming to a dead stop when Jesus and Peter got on the boat. And then the mystery deepens even further, much further, when we come upon Mark's startling postscript to all of this. He says this in Mark chapter 6, verses 51 to 52, "Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped. And they were utterly astonished," it says, "for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, and their heart was hardened," it says. Did you catch all of that? They were utterly astonished. Exis temi, I think temi, however you pronounce that. The word used best translates as they were amazed out of their wits. And then they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves. Sinemi. It's the same word that's used in Matthew 13, verse 13, where, quoting the prophet Isaiah, Jesus describes people as hearing but not understanding, seeing but not perceiving. And then thirdly, he says, their heart was hardened. The word is poros, a kind of stone. The word picture that is used, it pictures a heart that is rendered dull, rendered stupid, rendered encrusted by callous. Do you see how, under inspiration of the Spirit, Mark has just blown away all of the disciples from the water? What a terrible, utterly devastating insight into their heart of hearts. They had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, and their heart was hardened. Then if that be the case, all the more it leads us to ask, why is John's account of these events so meager? Why do his words read like they're unimportant background material? He doesn't tell us why. But these accounts, when you take them together like this, they paint a startling, shocking picture that does, doesn't it? Was Jesus aware of this? Of course he was. Again and again he's shown us he can read minds, he can read hearts, and of course he saw all of this very, very clearly. And then there's this little note that Matthew left us. A note that gives us stirring insight into how Jesus felt in the wake of the feeding of the 5,000. After he had sent the crowds away, it says he went up that mountain by himself to pray. That's verse 23 of Matthew 14. And I take it just to make sure we catch the gripping pathos that drips out of all of this, Matthew, he repeats himself. And he says, and when it was evening, he was there alone. Verse 24. Now consider how Jesus must have felt. I really believe this is the main reason he went up that mountain to pray. He'd been reading the disciples' hearts. These were the very same ones that he had personally handpicked. Those who were the very closest to them. They were told that in John 6, in verse 70. They were handpicked, and they were very, very close to him. And seeing right through this, Jesus was heartbroken. Heartbroken over, what word shall we use? Their cluelessness? No, not even close. Their horrible fecklessness? A little stronger, but no, again, that falls short. Well, here's the thing. The original word poros is really quite accurately used today when we speak of people who have been hardened. Hardened as in hardened criminals or hardened law enforcers who, when enraged, will shoot protesters or minors in cold blood. You see that that's a picture, that's a very picture that's being drawn here. People who have become desensitized, people who have become so deadened that they're no longer shocked or moved to empathy or to compassion like most people would be. It's a terrible characterization, isn't it? There we ask why? Why the characterization? Actually, it's not rocket science. If you really think about it, they had been right there with him. They had been in the midst of the throng of humanity. They had been right there with him. They had been frontliners, directly in the midst of the incomparable miracle with him. From up close, they had seen him creating those loaves and those pickled fish out of nothing. From up close, they had seen him feeding that multitude until they could eat no more. They had seen that motley crowd of thousands eat until they were so full they could eat no more. The word is empletho. It comes from animal husbandry. It means they were all fathered up. The whole crowd, that whole crowd had eaten. That crowd of thousands, they had eaten until they were fathered up like feeding animals in a trough filled to the point of satiety. They were in the midst of all of that. They had seen it all from up close. Staggering, monumental miracle. Thousands upon thousands of people. And yet Mark tells us they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves. Their heart was hardened. Now, Jesus might not have taken notice if one or two had been that way. That would have been par for the course, I think. But all of them, and seeing, knowing all of that, as only God himself could, how does Jesus respond to that? Well, our composite word pictures, they tell us. Firstly, he sends them away into the storm, verse 45. Secondly, he watches them as they strain against the oars for hours, making no headway. Mark 6, verse 48. Evidently, he waited until the very last minute, and then he comes to them walking on the water in absolute total control in the midst of the howling storm. How does Jesus respond? Well, when he has the timing just right, when all of the disciples are exactly where he wants them, Jesus unleashes a spectacular flurry of miracles. 4 of them, back to back. He walks the turbulent waters. He saves Peter from his folly and walks him to the churning boat, Matthew 14:28-31. And then notice, we are pointedly told this, that as soon as he and Peter get onto that boat, at that very moment, Jesus abruptly stops the wind. That gale force wind, he stops it dead. That's Mark chapter 6, verse 51, and Matthew chapter 14, verse 32. And then, as though all those 3 miracles back to back were not enough, Jesus brings this all to a fabulous, unforgettable climax. In the blink of an eye, he sips them all to where they had been trying to go but couldn't get to, despite hour after hour of straining at the oars against the wind and the waves. And now, finally, after all of that, almost as though they had been all simultaneously zapped in the chest by a mega spike of electricity, by an emergency room defibrillator, finally, their hardened hearts take over and come alive. And curiously, Matthew alone records the scene for us. Those who were in the boat, they worshipped him, saying, "You certainly are God's Son." Verse 33, Matthew 14. No wonder John was at a loss for words. Clearly the most visceral, the most sensitive of the gospel writers, he's emotionally overwrought. I rather think most of us would have been too if we had been there. Reflecting on all of this later, I think he would have been terribly embarrassed, deflated, probably even emotional. They had seen it all. Sign after sign after sign, shouting out who Jesus really was. They had seen it all, heard it all in Judea, they heard it in Jerusalem, and now daily for months on end in Galilee. From anywhere from 6 months to a year now in Galilee, scholars studying all of this, they tell us in Cana, in Bethsaida, in Capernaum, in Gennesaret, in Decapolis, they had all been seeing miracles day after day after day, miracle after miracle. Do you know that until fairly recent times, this mind-blowing explosion of miracles had remained totally unchallenged? Unchallenged because there were just too many of them. Unchallenged because there were simply too many, done out in the open in full view of thousands of eyewitnesses. So many, and yet not one claimed that they had been faked. Not one claimed that they were fictitious. Not one claimed that they were trickery or some kind of sleight of hand. Not while the eyewitnesses lived. Why, that monumental miracle we opened John chapter 6 with had not just been witnessed and directly participated in by thousands. They were there. They were participants in that miracle. Conservatively, we're told 25,000 when you include women and children. Eyewitnesses. They had been right there. And now, amazingly, in these crazy, crazy days we live in, so-called scholars, cynics, and skeptics riding the crest of the atheistic humanism that's spiraling out all around us, they challenge this. They challenge it centuries later. Centuries later, they try to append all of this. Amazingly, they do take us, all of us, including us here at GFC, as gullible fools. And they'll do that again and again, if you let them. Like the fools and buffoons that now surround them, these so-called scholars, cynics, and skeptics. Now, think about this. This was a massive, unforgettable moment for the disciples on that boat. Jesus had just made sure they knew, without a doubt, who they were dealing with. He had deliberately sent them into that storm. He had them straining at the oars for hours, getting nowhere, to set all of this up. And by unleashing that flurry of back-to-back miracles, he made sure they all knew for certain who he was. They all knew he was the long-awaited Messiah prophesied by their own scriptures. Those 300 plus prophecies that found all over their scriptures. They all knew this was God himself in the flesh. Did they get it? Of course they did. That's why they all spontaneously turned to him and worshiped. That's why they're all probably on their knees declaring, "You certainly are God's son." Matthew 14, verse 33. And you would have thought that they would have all come away from that moment changed forever. But no, this much we know. If you take a look at Matthew chapter 16, from verses 5 to 7, this is what Jesus' own startling postscript, recorded for all of us to closely ponder. Verse 5, the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And they began to discuss among themselves, saying, "He said that because we did not bring any bread." But Jesus, aware of this, he said to them, "You men of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves that you have no bread? Do you not understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you picked up? Now, I want you to notice that the indictment very clearly covers all of them now. You men of little faith. Jesus says, do you not yet understand? Do you not yet remember the loaves of the 5,000, how many baskets full you picked up? What a stirring, heart-rending moment. Do you not remember that there were 12 baskets full after all of the fragments had been gathered up? 12 baskets full. 12, one for each of you. 12 baskets full. 12 to carry down that mountain, that you might each have a personal reminder, a personal monument of all this for the rest of your lives. Do you see how Jesus had yanked out the floor from under all of them? How he leaves them all naked and embarrassed, devastatingly so? Obviously, this is all so massively important. But why? Why is this all so important? Well, having all of this inspired and recorded for us, we can all see why this side of the cross. Jesus knew only too well that there will be countless numbers of people who profess to be his followers. That there would be countless people who would profess to be believers, who would actually believe that they were, but who would all turn out and prove themselves to be utterly false disciples. This, my friends, is what John 6 is all about. To see that clearly, all you need to do is just look through the end of this chapter. And we're going to be doing that very closely in the coming weeks as we consider John's Bread of Life discourse from verses 32 to 60. But this morning, let's go get ourselves a quick bird's eye view, shall we? John 6, verses 58 to 60. At the very end of the Bread of Life discourse, this is what it says. This is the bread which came down out of heaven. He who eats this bread will live forever. The things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. And therefore, many of the disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it? And starting in verse 61, Jesus, he goes on to say this. Conscious that his disciples grumbled at this, he said to them, does this cause you to stumble? What then if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life, he says. Take note of this. The flesh profits nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are spirit and life. And then, verse 64 and 66, and there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe, and who it was who would betray him. As a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. And so Jesus, turning to the 12, said, you do not want to go away also, do you? Do you see that Jesus saw all of this coming? Very early in his ministry, he had told them so. He told them that people would walk away because they feared persecution. He'd walk away because they would be attracted, even follow for a little while, but the deceitfulness of riches, the love of money would pull them away, like the rich young ruler. He told them that many would be lured and they would be seduced by the world system. He told them they would abandon him because they valued comfort and ease more, like the disciple who wanted to collect money that was coming to him before he would follow. He told them many would defect because of treasured relationships with family, with close friends and others, that those were simply more important, too important to walk away from. There's a plethora of reasons why people defect from seriously following after Jesus Christ. But not here in John 6. In John 6, disciples walked away and defected because of what he, Jesus Christ, said. It wasn't about relationships. It wasn't about the world. It wasn't about riches. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about persecution. In John 6, it was Jesus' words that drove them out. For this reason, it says in verse 65 of John 6, as a result of this, it says in verse 66, they all refer back to verse 63, the words, I have spoken to you, they are spirit and life. In John 6, they walked away and defected because of his teaching. This is exactly what we were warned of in Psalm 95, which we read as we started today. Psalm 95 in the New American Standard. Verse 7, it says, He is our God, we are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his words, mark this, do not harden your hearts. As at Meribah, as in the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me. For 40 years I loathed that generation. And then look at his exposition of what he means. They are a people, hardened hearts. They are a people who err in their hearts, and they do not know my ways. That's what it says. Jesus, he saw all of this coming. Looking outward in time, he saw that there would be many who would profess to be his followers, profess to be believers, many who would actually believe falsely. Looking out in time, he saw that there would be many who would do that, yet prove themselves to be utterly false disciples. Prove themselves to be that by the very witness of their lives. And more importantly, he saw how even his own disciples were in mortal danger of getting caught up in all of that. He saw how they would be in danger, not so much probably from avoiding persecution or longing after riches or the lures of the world, maybe not even from the pull of people and relationships. He saw that they would be in danger from defecting and walk away by drifting from his words, by double-mindedness, by doubt, by compromise, and worst of all, overtaken, sidelined as a result of all of that, by the gradual hardening of their hearts and their minds. This was a massive, unforgettable moment for the disciples on that boat. It was clearly time to separate the men from the boys. Time to separate the true disciples from the spurious ones. This was clearly the time before crucial events in John 6, later in John 6, would be upon them. Now, God usually uses fire, adversity, sickness, loss of livelihood to separate the genuine from the fakers, the pure from the dross. But ever creative, in our passage today, God uses trial by water. And it's been written up by John so understatedly, all of this might have passed us by if we had just not been paying close attention. Much later, the disciples all probably looked back to this key watershed moment. I say that because history tells us 11 of those men on that boat, they willingly went to martyrs' deaths along with hundreds of others rather than walk away and defect from Jesus Christ. Ironically, the reported events, even the flurry of the 4 back-to-back miracles, stand at the background of the spectacular feeding of thousands. But together, they are massively important to the disciples. And I hasten to add, my friends, massively important to us today. Just think of how many today do the very things that Jesus knew the disciples were in danger of. How many today profess Christianity and yet live lives that say God is their riches, their money, the very picture of the rich young ruler. How so many profess to know Christ and yet endlessly pursue fulfillment and significance from palatial houses, from signature clothes and accessories, from a stable of multi-million peso cars, toys, hobbies. How so many young and old alike today, increasingly value lifestyles that revolve around self-focus, around luxury cruises, around extravagant vacations, around trips of the world. Meron na yata ako nasagasaan sa inyo, but I don't do that decidedly, okay? How so many have defected from treasured relationships. You know, they have defected because treasured relationships with family, with close friends, are simply more important, too important to walk away from. We've seen quite a few of those in recent times, haven't we? But never mind them. Let's talk about us. Thankfully, I don't think I have to jazz up how this applies to a group like this. I think most of you are already thinking up what you're going to do about this. But let me just walk us through quickly as we wind up today. Firstly, this very clearly says that God is always watching us. Just as He knew what the disciples were going through, so He knows and watches what each of us is going through. Now, He probably won't make things too easy for any of us. He knows muscles that are never used, they grow flabby, and eventually they atrophy. So like the disciples, we must somehow row in rough weather sometimes. But we know, even as we do that Jesus' eye is upon us. Mark chapter 10, in verses 29 to 31, tells us this so poetically. It says, "Not a sparrow falls to the ground without His knowledge," He says. "All the hairs of our head are numbered," it adds. Now that's true of everyone, of course. But our passage says that He is with us, just as He was with the disciples on that boat. Now that is entirely different. He is with us. He sees us, watches us like that. Secondly, God watches us not with some kind of serene and unmoved detachment. No, He watches us with a mind to help. And He does help all the time. But particularly when life becomes very burdensome, when spiritual victory seems beyond our grasp, just like He came to the help of those disciples on the fourth watch of that fateful night. And think about this. He not only helped, in the blink of an eye, He got them to where they were going, didn't He? And that's what I found most comforting from all of this, that you can be sure Jesus will get you to where you're going. Or to put it more exactly, that He will get you to where He has called you to go, the exact way and the time that He explicitly intended. Now, friends, I never doubted, not once since 2012, almost over 5 years ago now, the year that I found out I had prostate cancer. The very same one that killed my father in 1994. I know exactly where I'm going, that He has Himself called me to go there. I do not fear death. I know where I'm going. But I got to tell you, having seen so much pain and suffering in those I've known, I've always been deathly scared of the passing. That's what I'm scared of. I was deathly scared until I started studying this passage. He watches, He knows when and how to take us home. And then finally, surely we see this. Surely we see that when Jesus commands, from all of this, we see that when Jesus commands, He enables. That when He asks us to do more than we are humanly able to do, He always enables us to do what He asks. The disciples, they reacted the way they did because the task at hand was impossible. Nevertheless, Jesus laid the responsibility for feeding 25,000 people on them. And not only were they able to feed all of them until they were filled, they even ended up with a surplus. Now, I have to be very careful with this, lest you hear me saying, give in order to get. But isn't it interesting that the boy who gave 5 loaves and fish, he ended up with all that he could eat, far more than he brought. And isn't it even more interesting that disciples who thought they had nothing and were arguing, they all ended up with a full, each of them, a full basket of overruns, each one of them. You see, God ministers through our weakness. He does not select strong people so that he can use their strengths. He chooses the weak, the not so smart, even the foolish, we are told, and delights in demonstrating his power through them. Sheer magnitude, even impossibility, ought to drive us to action, not to hesitation and inaction. Very clearly, despite all of the odds that they laid on us, our 3 years in GFC now has proven that again and again and again. Now, I didn't set out thinking our passage was material for a turn of the new year challenge message, but that's just what the text has led us to. Jesus' words, his teaching constantly lays upon us human impossibilities. For example, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Matthew chapter 5. And it says, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Again, Matthew chapter 5. Human impossibilities, all of them. How often shall I forgive a brother who sins against me? Asked Peter of the Lord. And Jesus said to them, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. No, he said, take 7, the measure of perfection, multiply it by 10, the measure of completion, and then multiply what you get again by 7. That's how many times you forgive. That's what he said. What does that mean? No limit, he said. Clearly a human impossibility. Now stop and seriously think. Think of all of these clearly impossible words, and don't forget that they are not suggestions. They are not options to consider. They're commands. We are being commanded to do them. Think about that when next time you're against let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it'll give grace to those who hear. Think about that the next time you're tempted to rant and to rave against someone, particularly in social media. Think about that. Will it give grace to those who read that? That's what it's saying. Or do nothing from selfishness or human conceit, but with the humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Think about how counterintuitive that is. And again, never again forget that that's not a suggestion, not an option to mull over and consider. Stop praying for power, for enablement to do that. It's a command. He enables what he commands, silly boy. It's time to separate real men from little boys. It's time to separate true disciples from spurious ones. It's time to separate the genuine from the fake. Playtime is over. Think about that as we close the year and open our 4th year as GFC. Think about that. Just to remind all of you, the various ministries reopening, Women of Grace, the book of Galatians, Bible study, restarts on January 5 at Jollibee Commerce Center. PDF 242 restarts on January 11 at the Canvas events on Westgate. And Men of the Word, the men's ministry, starts up on the 20th of January. We don't have a site specific yet, but keep the 20th in mind. Let's pray. Keep us faithful, Lord Jesus. Let the words of our mouth, the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. Testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgment of the Lord are true. They are righteous altogether. Keep us faithful, day after day, as long as it is called today. Keep us. Guard us from hardening our hearts against your words. And his people, the real ones, all said, Amen and amen. Blessed, happy 2018, everybody.